Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Leon Hartwell. Welcome to another LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine dialogue. We are now part funded by PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. Thank you also to our co-organizer for this event, China Foresight, the China-focused research project at LSE IDEAS. Today, we will be focusing on the future of China-Russia relations. Shortly before the February escalation, China-Russia relations entered into a comprehensive strategic partnership that, as Putin and Xi Jinping declared, has no limits. Russian troops have not been able to take over Ukraine in a matter of weeks. Rather, Ukraine has been able to defend and deter Russia well beyond any initial expectations. To Xi Jinping, it should be clear by now that China has allied itself with a weak Russia. Putin's aggression in Ukraine contradicts Beijing's position on non-intervention, and it generates a multitude of problems with China's biggest trading partner, the European Union. In September, Putin even acknowledged that Xi might have some questions and concerns about the war, but he never elaborated about his Chinese counterparts' worries, leading some pundits to speculate about possible rifts between the two leaders. At the same time, China is able to capitalize and even exploit Russia's weakened position, which may widen the increasingly asymmetrical power relationship between the two countries. That begs the question, how did Putin's actions in Ukraine and Russia's significant losses affect China-Russia relations? Where are we heading with this no-limits relationship? To help us answer those questions, we will turn to three experts. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Dr. Björn Alexander Düben, assistant professor at Yale University in China. Secondly, I would like to welcome Yu Jie, senior research fellow on China at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Lukas Fiala, project coordinator at our China Foresight program at LSE IDEAS. Let's turn to Alexander first. If you could unmute for us, please. Could you provide us with an overview of the Russia-China political relations since the February escalation? And specifically, how did Beijing's position and strategies evolve since February? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon, and thank you very much for inviting me. I will talk about this mainly through the lens of Beijing's reaction to the war and its subsequent interaction with Russia. And I think that reaction can best be summarized as keeping up a pretense of neutrality while providing consistent but qualified support for Russia. Now, we first look at the diplomatic front. This approach has entailed shielding Russia diplomatically, internationally, mainly by casting favorable votes in international forums like the United Nations. So whenever there have been Ukraine-related votes at international forums such as the Security Council, the General Assembly, but also UN subsidiaries like the Human Rights Council, the International Atomic Energy Organization, or also organizations like the G20 or forums like the G20, the International Court of Justice, we've seen that Beijing's representatives have generally cast abstentions, but in some occasions they have actively voted along with Moscow to oppose punitive measures that were to be imposed against Russia. So there's been that. Beijing has also made a point of repeatedly publicly reaffirming the strength of its bilateral partnership with Moscow, albeit in less glowing terms than before the war. Also, very importantly, I think Beijing has actively supported and amplified the Russian narrative about what is happening in Ukraine and why. So both in its official statements, but also throughout all of its state-controlled media channels, Chinese officials and Chinese media have largely carbon copied the Russian narrative with some minor deviations. Just as an example, there's overlap between Chinese and Russian narrative about Ukraine has been particularly conspicuous when Moscow started to make allegations about the US operating biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine. And that was something which was quite enthusiastically adopted by Chinese media and Chinese officials. And it's been a story that has received extremely wide-ranging and ongoing coverage in China until today. As one of the central claims in this narrative, the Chinese government and state media have consistently maintained that the West is the one that bears the responsibility for the war in Ukraine. Since by pursuing NATO enlargement, they claim that the US and its allies have backed Russia into a corner. They've also constantly accused the West of prolonging the conflict by providing weapons to Ukraine. They've very vocally rejected all of the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia. And of course, there's also been continued active economic and military cooperation with Russia. But I think some of those aspects will be covered by my co-panelists very shortly in more detail. So if we look at what seems to be the Chinese leadership's overall aim regarding the Ukraine conflict, I would say, first of all, to keep a pretense of Chinese neutrality. So trying to minimize the fallout for China, particularly when it comes to trade ties with the West, with Europe, and so on. Secondly, simultaneously, of course, to avoid turning this into a victory for the West, especially for the US. So providing assistance to Russia where it can, where it's not costly for China. Beijing manifestly has no interest in seeing the Putin regime collapse. And in the context of the increasing discussion that we're having of this being like a global conflict between autocracy and democracy, of course, there's certainly also a concern in Beijing that if there was a downfall of Putin and his regime, this could also become potentially a danger for CCP rule in China, could at least have negative repercussions. And thirdly, I think another objective is to just seize opportunities for China whenever they present themselves, whether it's in terms of economic gains, whether it's in terms of potential strategic gains in East Asia, and of course, very importantly, to learn lessons about China's own future strategic interaction with the US and its allies. At the same time, I think Beijing clearly feels that the conflict comes with considerable cost to China as well. It's an emergent superpower. It aims to rival the US for international leadership. So it has a certain stake in a stable international order. And the instability that this conflict causes is not really in China's interest. And at the same time, we're having a situation where China itself is experiencing slowing growth, economic problems, particularly in the context of the zero COVID lockdowns in China. And an additional problem has been that this conflict has, as I said before, kind of raised more awareness of this angle of democracy versus autocracy. And I think that there's a rising suspicion now in many states, not just of Russia, but also of what China might do in the future, both in Europe, but also I think in East and South Asia as well. And yet, this doesn't mean, even though there are these costs attached to it, I think this doesn't mean that at any point in the near future or even distant future, China would start to side more openly with the West against Russia. One of China's leading foreign policy scholars, Yan Xietong, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs a while ago, and he pointed out that Beijing has few incentives for siding with the West against Russia. Beijing does not believe that seeking common ground with Washington on the war in Ukraine will meaningfully improve broader ties with the US and would sort of end US containment policy against China anyway. And if we look at the recent kind of top-level appointments in China's foreign policy apparatus after the 20th Party Congress, it doesn't look like Xi Jinping is steering away from confrontation with the West. I think we'll see more of this coming anyway. It's a very ideologized approach. So what does it all mean in terms of, has there been any change or evolution of Beijing's position and strategies in recent months? I think there are various indicators of frustrations and surprise about what's happening in Ukraine, but I don't think there have been any radical changes in China's approach. There's some US intelligence reports that have indicated that China's leaders appear to have been quite unsettled by Russia's military difficulties in Ukraine, that Xi Jinping himself has been unsettled about the Chinese government's own intelligence and political estimates and how wrong they have been in the run-up to the war. But even though there have been some views coming out of the Chinese government basically stating, how Russia is on a losing streak and how it was a real mistake to embark on this, I think in general, we don't see any major change. I think what we've seen in recent months is that China has maybe very subtly dialed down its kind of visible, conspicuous support for Russia, as Putin was escalating the situation more and more through mobilization, through nuclear threats, and so on and so forth. I think Xi Jinping might be interested in no longer being so publicly associated with Putin, as he will no longer go out on a limb to demonstrate how close their relationship is. But I don't necessarily detect any substantial change here. I mean, the basic media narrative coming out of China and the official narrative about the conflict seems to still be the same. Military cooperation remains close. China has participated in some major Russian military drills in recent months, also has joint patrols, for example, close to Japan and so on. So it doesn't seem like there's any real disengagement anywhere here. And comments by leading officials, like, for example, Li Jianshu in September, they indicate that, that the support for Russia, albeit subtle, albeit kind of understated, remains relatively strong. I think I might leave it here. One question, of course, that I might want to still raise is coming out of the 20th Party Congress. I mean, this was, of course, a time, the run-up to the Congress was a time that kind of may have paralyzed Chinese decision-making on foreign policy to some extent. So maybe we will now see some change in the coming weeks and months now that Xi Jinping has firmly established himself. But so far, I don't see any major indication of that.
Thank you, Alexander. Thanks. That's a great intro to this discussion. I think before we turn to military issues, let's first look at this delicate economic relationship also. And for that, I'd like to turn to Yu Jie. Please, could you provide us with an overview of trade and financial relations between Russia and China since the February escalation? And in particular, could you discuss what the trade data tells us about China's response to Western sanctions? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hartwell. I'm really delighted to return to LSE IDEAS, myself being one of the founders of China Foresight. So really delighted to have Lukas and Julia work together on this event. For me, it's almost like homecoming. Now, Leon, to answer your question and also to answer Björn's question later regarding the 20th Party Congress, I think what we can see so far is that China and Russia remain two different kind of players on the international stage when it comes to economic diplomacy. I mean, obviously, we know that Russia is really the second-tier economy that believes trying to exert its international influence through territory and military conquest. Exactly what it has done was the invasion towards Ukraine and also on the engagement in the Middle East. However, for China, is a 21st century global power that exerting its influence through integrate itself into the global economy. Therefore, once it comes to the divisions between these two, actually, when it comes to the economic and finance part, I see far more divergence between the two rather than convergence between Beijing and Moscow. Now, Leon, you asked me about the trading data. I've been looking into the trading data before the seminar. So between 2008 and up until today, China has remained as the #1 trading partner with Russia, whereas Russia has always remained a number 17 or number 18 trading partner with Beijing. And there's very little economic complementarities with the two powers because China is pretty much focusing on manufacturing products, whereas on the other hand, Russia is focusing on primary material. So this to put two different kind of economic powers in here. Of course, in the short term, that China will financially benefit enormously when it comes to absorbing and buying oils and primary materials, and then also offering the ability of producing the refinery products from the primary oil, like, for example, the refineries, and providing LNGs to Europe. I mean, this is what China could take the short-term interest for that. But I think over the longer term, I think this is really also a conviction for Beijing that its own economic future, it doesn't depend on an amenable relationship with Russia, but actually its own economic future depends on, firstly, how China is going to manage its so-called economic self-reliance. And secondly, whether China will be able to reconcile this much fraught relations between its major trading partners, such as United States and EU. So I think these are two things really bogged down at the end of the day, make China realize perhaps having a close tie with Moscow, it is not exactly in its economic interest. But having said that, I think what really prompted Beijing to make the choice on the 24th of February, it is not an economic question in here, but it's actually a political question. And as what Björn said, is an ideological question. Now, firstly, let's look into the national security question. Both countries share a border of 4,500 kilometers. So it's the width of Europe, it's the distance between London to Edinburgh. If China cannot handle Russia well, and especially destabilize Russia, and Russia would present as the biggest national threat for Beijing. So I think that's the reason, number one, they have made such a choice. Now, secondly, China-Russia relations are not bounded by shared ideology, but bounded by shared hatreds towards United States hegemony. I mean, in the eyes of Putin and also in the eyes of Xi Jinping. So these are the two things that made prompt Beijing to make such a choice. But however, the triangle which we tend to ignore in here is how is China's relationship with Ukraine looks like. Don't forget, even before the conflict, that Ukraine was ranking among top 10 foreign aid recipients from China. So China obviously pay enormous economic interest within Ukraine. And also on top of that, you have the Belt and Road Initiative has been launched in the past 9 years. And Ukraine has been one of the key geographical positions for China to carry forward its Belt and Road Initiative. So that is a piece of jigsaw we tend to ignore. It seems to be that China somehow didn't have much relationship, nothing to do with Ukraine at all. Actually, for all this many years, and what China has been trying to do is trying to maintain a reasonable relationship with both sides. And that's why Beijing suggested it may want to engage with the discussions on peaceful negotiations, so on and so forth. But however, given Beijing's pro-Russia neutrality, as what Björn laid out very clearly, Beijing is really not in the best position to do that peaceful negotiation, so on and so forth. So that is Beijing's the really hindrance in here. Now, secondly, when it comes to foreign affairs course correction, as what Björn was alluded to after the 20th Party Congress, I think we can boldly say that, yes, the great power competition, it is here to stay. Because it's for the first time, Xi Jinping did not offer the word that China still is in a time of the so-called window of strategic opportunity, hence to have a stable international environment to enable China's own economic developments. That phrase has been dropped completely. Now, the second glaring conspicuous omission, absence, is the term of the so-called new type of great power relations. Again, Xi Jinping didn't use that term, and that term is referring to China's relationship with part of the West, but it's also a reference to China's relationship with Russia as well. Great power, including Russia. And that means China will also be less fixated towards Russia as well. And instead, China will be much more interested in developing relationship with the global South countries, as Xi Jinping doubled down the rhetoric, as you can see from his political report. Now, let's look into the personnel appointment. As we all know that in the time of May this year, the well-known Russian specialist who tipped it to be the foreign minister for Beijing from next March onward has been put aside, precisely, firstly, because it's no limit rhetoric, that is make the biggest diplomatic misgiving for Beijing. And secondly, it is also because its pro-Russia, Russia-centered foreign policy has left Beijing very little room to maneuver. So that really makes Xi Jinping reconsider its diplomatic team. And therefore, as you carefully observe the list of people sitting on the Central Committee, by the way, the Central Committee of the Communist Party is the equivalent 1922 committee of the British Tory Party. Yeah, if I'm speaking to the British audience in here. You have three of them who have the foreign affairs portfolios. You have Liu Jianchao, you have Qin Gang, Liu Haixing, and then you also have the now the Politburo member Wang Yi. the most likely appointment is going to be someone who are very familiar with European and American affairs, and precisely because Xi Jinping felt with the current work portfolio of the Chinese Foreign Ministry spent too much energy and focus towards Russia. Therefore, perhaps it's the time for Beijing to tilt back to refocusing on its relationship with the West, because ultimately that's where China's economic future lies, and ultimately that is really would help China in a greater extent, not necessarily just only go work together with Russia. Because if we look into the cost and benefit for Beijing's association on this alignment, and I see more costs than benefit. I mean, the real benefit, as I said earlier, is precisely for the national security and also the common disagreement with the United States in here. But other than that, I don't really think, considering the type of power China it is right now as being an international economic global power, it is really not in China's interest at all. Now, also very lastly, if China has somehow sided with Russia, and this whole notion of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, the first one and foremost is that sense of territorial integrity should be respected. And what Russia has done is a direct infringement of national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine as well. So it's a very difficult thing for Beijing to unhook itself, because agree one thing and promise one thing in the first place, and then it's very hard to follow that deeds. Now, this also raised the Taiwan question. Given the Russia's invasion towards Ukraine, and that is obviously also increasing in the international profile, international focus towards Taiwan. But I wouldn't necessarily consider that Xi Jinping it is a more risk-taking character like Vladimir Putin. So far, the responses from Xi Jinping, he seems to be a very cautious person and a rational person. And he would really acknowledge the colossal damage that in case of military escalation towards Taiwan. So I think it's really what Russia has done right now, offer Beijing a live simulation. And perhaps this would hinder Beijing's capability and really have to think about very carefully what it's going to do with Taiwan. So I leave it there and much look forward to hear your questions and comments.
Thank you for introducing a whole range of complex issues there also that are not entirely black and white. One issue that we will circle back to is the issue of China-Ukraine also. But before we do that, let's first go to Lukas to talk about military issues. Now, Lukas, prior to the escalation, the People's Liberation Army and Russian military were in close cooperation for training purposes, staff structures, and reforms. Could you shed light on military cooperation between Russia and China and how this has changed since February? Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Leon. It's great to be here, and I will, in LSE fashion, front load the argument with a slight spoiler alert. I will echo what some of my panelists have already said, my fellow panelists, in that indeed I don't see a lot of change since the invasion, particularly as regards military to military ties. But I think it's worthwhile thinking a bit through the history of military to military cooperation, and for analytical purposes, also separating defense industrial ties between the two countries' defense industrial bases from military diplomacy. So we'll talk about the military ties first, and then I think towards a later date, towards a later stage in the webinar, we'll return to the defense industry. Of course, a broader context, it was understandable that many of us observers and policymakers were worried about a Sino-Russian military alliance of sorts. We've heard already about Beijing's refusal to condemn the invasion. And of course, the close military-to-military relationship between Moscow and Beijing has obviously fueled, a sort of fear that China may now militarily support Russia more closely after the invasion. But I think those fears were slightly overblown. It is not yet a full-blown alliance, but I would define it as a historically close relationship. And of course, both states have sort of post-communist and sort of post-Leninist political systems, and the role of the military in these regimes is, of course, absolutely key to national stability. I would argue perhaps even more so in China than in Russia. And for China, drawing lessons and thinking about how other militaries are faring, and particularly cooperating and learning from other countries' armed forces is absolutely key. As we've known, China has last fought a war with a sort of border skirmish with Vietnam in the late 70s. And the proximity of the Russian military in terms of training, and as you've mentioned, staff exchanges and equipment, of course, make Ukraine an interesting case study for the PLA. And I think before we delve into some of the more present day issues, it might be worth revisiting the history here. We've already heard Cherry mentioned the Sino-Russian border, of course, and military-to-military cooperation really improved in the 1990s, partly as a form of confidence building measures as both countries tried to desecuritize their joint border. Of course, in turn, right, that frees up resources in terms of military resources that both countries needed for other theaters. In the case of China, of course, the South China Sea and, of course, the Eastern Theater Command with Taiwan comes up. It's worth to note that the relationship between the PLA and the Russian armed forces has certainly become closer in recent years. And the PLA has definitely looked quite closely at the Russian new look military reforms. Those were initiated around 2008. Both countries have signed sort of military cooperation agreements, one of them in late 2021. So there's clearly a sort of high level interest, right, in furthering military to military ties on both sides. The most significant aspect, perhaps, are joint exercises. They have been not only a focal point for cooperation between Russia and China, but they've, of course, also in and of themselves act as a sort of confidence-building measure, right? Also furthering, of course, networking and personnel exchanges between the Chinese and the Russian armed forces. China and Russia first participated in a joint exercise, when I exercise under the SEO, I should say, in 2003. And their joint bilateral exercise started off in 2005. Now, those are large and they are oftentimes multi-domain. And in recent years, we've seen that they've even gone beyond the immediate region of China's and Russia's border, of the sort of East Asian region, towards places like the Gulf of Aden, where both countries, for instance, have held parallel naval drills in 2009. There's different counts for how many exercises China and Russia have really jointly engaged in. Some numbers put them at several dozens, close to 80. And we see a significant uptake in these since 2016, again, suggesting that, as China has turned to become a more senior partner in this relationship, it has really tried to learn from Russia and really tried to also use these exercises to forge a closer military cooperation or military relationship with Russia. Now, as to how really important these exercises are, that's a bit of another question. There seem to be two opinions. There's some that argue that this is mostly deterrent signaling, of course, mainly towards the US, the joint common enemy, so to say, and their allies within NATO. And others argue that, no, these are actually rather significant, and they are meant to prepare China and Russia towards perhaps at some point even staging a joint intervention in Central Asia, or perhaps cooperating on expeditionary missions, right, expeditionary operations somewhere out in the far seas. Now, those, I would argue, are perhaps visions of a future that the Ukraine war has slightly changed. But China, nonetheless, right, surely benefits in important ways. China needs, as I've mentioned, operational experience. And of course, it can't hurt to signal to the US and NATO that, indeed, the two countries are close military partners. Fast forward into the present day, I think over the last couple of years, we've seen a slight changing of the tides in the sort of Sino-Russian military relationship in line with China's emergence as the more senior partner. Chinese experts have regarded the Interaction 2021 exercise, for instance, as fairly unique because not only did both sides exercise together, but they also reportedly cooperated in planning and in sort of developing and commanding the training exercise. And state media in China back then heralded this as sort of the first exercise where the PLA has really sort of led the game, so to speak. And the first time that this exercise was held in China, it also included a lot of Chinese equipment. Now, it's fairly certain that this trend of China as the sort of more senior partner will likely also persist in this military partnership, but it might still be a bit early to tell. So I think it's worth to think about what the actual facts are over the last few months. And I mean, Alexander has already alluded to this. We have seen a joint sort of drill of Russian and Chinese planes near Japan in May. That was likely aimed at the Quad, right, that I think was meeting at the time in Japan. And then we've also seen the Vostok 2022 exercise in September, just a couple of months ago, where China, of course, contributed troops among also other countries. And the Global Times at the time, sort of a very well-known tabloid, certainly not an authoritative source on what the regime thinks, right? It is really more of a source of how the party state tries to propagandize certain political events. But nonetheless, it noted that this was the first time that China had sent forces from all three main branches of the PLA, main service branches of the PLA, to a single Russian drill. So at least in terms of how these things are communicated, right? The Chinese government and the sort of Chinese propaganda apparatus wants us to believe that military-to-military ties are still strengthening. So I think to perhaps conclude and sum up, we will probably need a bit more time to evaluate exactly how the Russian war in Ukraine will impact this military relationship. But at the moment, right, I really see more continuity, and I think it's sort of more continuity in the sense of both over the last 6 months, but also, within the sort of long array of this fairly close military partnership under Putin and Xi over the last decade. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Lukas, also for all the military context also in terms of those relations. I'm going to ask Alexander to perhaps follow up on what Lukas discussed. Alexander, what do you expect the war has revealed about the PLA's military strategy and force posture, and what are the potential problems, at least from China's perspective, that need to be resolved within the PLA? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Leon, and thanks to my co-panelists for some very insightful introductions there. And yeah, this might overlap, of course, a bit with what Lukas has said, but in general, if we talk about the lessons that the PLA might have learned from this war up to date, obviously this is still very speculative at this point, right? We've only seen kind of snippets of potential initial findings and conclusions that the Chinese military might have drawn, and also the learning and reform process that arises from this conflict in the military sphere will probably take years to conclude and to lead to implementation. But I think we can sketch out some likely thought processes within China's military leadership. I think it's clear that China pays very close attention to the military developments in Ukraine, and Lukas has already laid out how close their military cooperation with Russia has been. It's important that within the PLA, there's very few people at all that have any first-hand battle experience. Almost no one really. So it's always been one important aspect, I think, of the military relationship with Russia, the military exchanges, that Russia has this operational experience that China could also then draw on. There's very few partners that China has where it could sort of exchange these sort of experiences at that level. So this war now is, of course, an invaluable opportunity for Chinese war planners to learn about their own battlefield vulnerabilities at someone else's expense. So one thing, of course, this war has almost certainly led to in China is a re-evaluation of Russia's military capabilities, considering the remarkable failures of Russia to attain even some seemingly simple strategic objectives on the ground, which could have potentially alarming implications for China's own defense capabilities. And of course, a primary focus inside China and outside China, perhaps more outside China, has been or will be the implications for the specific scenario of Taiwan and a potential future attempt to invade Taiwan. But of course, China's recent the Chinese government's quite belligerent statements in recent months regarding Taiwan and also military posturing have made this seemingly even more acute. So where do we expect any potential concrete changes in the PLA military strategy or force posture, as you asked? One thing that the war in Ukraine might have done is to reinforce a lot of lessons that the PLA had already learned, already been aware of, and some priorities that they'd already focused on before, one of them being joint operations. So we've seen some very considerable Russian weaknesses here. This has already been a years-long focus of PLA modernization, but I think this is going to once again underscore the importance of that, and trying to compensate for potential weaknesses here. Also, battle command performance. The PLA is certainly studying, battlefield leadership in Ukraine. It was reinforced the importance of discipline in the officer corps of any large military force. One critical Russian weakness seems to have been the non-commissioned officer corps, and China has already been kind of shoring that up for some time, or at least attempted to. Now, beyond those lessons that kind of the PLA was already aware of, what are other potential lessons that the PLA might be taking away from this war? One focuses presumably on the general nature and dynamics of sort of a modern hybrid battlefield, employing the assets that great powers bring to bear. We've seen features like the effectiveness of mobile anti-tank weapons in sort of an effective asymmetric resistance operation, long-range precision strikes, drone warfare, and so on. One other aspect is that in recent years, China has cut down the size of its ground army, and it's possible that now, observing the kind of maneuver warfare that we see in Ukraine, seeing that these Russian-style approaches of having battalions and brigades, sort of these smaller maneuver units, they do not seem to be performing particularly well on the battlefield, partially due to limited joint support. And this might also be a problematic implication for the PLA, since they have in the past copied the Russian-style kind of ground force structure, getting rid of larger unit structures, maybe too much so. So it might be also an important learning curve at the moment, something they focus on. Other potential lessons, the importance, of course, of morale, troop morale, also information warfare, the importance of information dominance and sort of Russia's failure in that regard, and how this has enabled Ukraine to mount a successful and coordinated defense, focusing on the importance of sort of military communications, but also civilian communications, thinking of Starlink, for example, which apparently has already led some Chinese scholars to argue for more effective anti-satellite capabilities in the future. Other kind of potential lessons may surround the importance of quick, decisive, overwhelming strikes, the fact that Russia's approach has become sort of too drawn out, the importance of the element of surprise, but also if the conflict does become protracted, as is now the case in Ukraine, being able to manage resources, reserves, supply lines. So, as I said, we can see snippets of information of the Chinese now increasing their focus on this, but it's hard to say exactly what lessons are being learned at the moment. But certainly, there's a strong focus on this. And I think China is probably pressing Russia to provide information on its experiences on the ground, on US security cooperation, on US training of Ukrainian troops, on sort of the experience of what the Russians could observe, the Ukrainian experience of adapting older military equipment to sort of newer Western provided assets. This is all something that could, of course, happen in the Taiwan scenario as well. So I assume that there's now a very strong, a very close exchange between Moscow and Beijing on all these matters, and China will certainly draw its conclusions from that. And by the way, Taiwan, of course, is also presumably observing this very closely and drawing its own conclusions in terms of its military modernization process. I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I think those are great lessons, especially taking into consideration that, if I'm not mistaken, China has not been at war technically since 1979, if I'm not mistaken. Let's turn again to Yu Jie. Thank you for mentioning earlier this really important piece of the puzzle, which is Ukraine, of course. So I'd like to ask you, how has the relationship between Ukraine and China changed over the course of the past 8 months? And also, how have relations changed between China and the EU, as well as we could throw in the UK over the Russia-Ukraine war? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon, for the question. I thought let's focusing on that piece of missing jigsaw in here. Before the conflict, as I said, the two countries share a reasonably good relationship, and also China's first aircraft carrier was actually, the model was purchased from Ukraine and then renovated into China's first aircraft carrier. So that's just to indicate to you that sense of military, I wouldn't say military cooperation, but military procurement that somehow the contract's going on. But I think after the February this year, China's reconsideration is what itself is going to do with Ukraine, and in particular, given the large number of foreign direct investment that China has invested in Ukraine over the last 10 years. So that was in one of the mystery for China. Secondly, what I've noticed that seems to be, from Beijing's point of view, that language towards Ukraine, from that sense of being very aloof and elusive, into something much warmer. So, I mean, I'm just compared with the two statements, one offered in April this year with Wang Yi and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba, and it was all, in April, was all about China's going to leave its hands off and stay aside, and hopefully things will resolve amenably. But however, in September, the meeting between Wang Yi and Kuleba and the joint statement, it reads more like, oh, China realized this war is going to last for much longer than we expected, and therefore China would be interested in step in as playing a mediation role. And also China's much hope to be able to help Ukraine focusing on reconstruction.
I'm not sure if anyone else can hear you at present. I think you've your video stopped. So are you back?
I'm back now. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, we can hear you. You cut out for about 30 seconds.
Okay. No, I mean, I'm not quite sure, like, to what extent that China firstly will be able to offer something meaningful towards Ukraine when it comes to economic reconstruction. And secondly, considering China's pro-Russian neutrality, it will be very hard to taking a position for it. So I'm not optimistic on the relationship between the two countries. But one thing which I can be sure is that the Chinese was able to vacate its citizens very quickly in the early period of the war. That's precisely because China had a good relationship with Ukraine. So that is a piece of jigsaw which is missing here. Now, secondly, if you ask me the comparison between what China is going to do with Europe, I think the thing we can all admit that China has overestimated the division between the United States and Europe before this war in Ukraine, therefore in terms of 4 years, and therefore there's much division going on the transatlantic partnership. But however, this division is much smaller than China expected. And I think China also underestimate this unity in the West between within the G7 and some other countries together, some other advanced economies. And hence, I think China has lost its opportunity to improve its already quite strained relationship with the EU earlier this year. So I think that's probably one of the miscalculations from the Beijing side. I'm not sure there's any other prospects that the relationship could improve at any time soon, as long as this war is ranging across the continent, as long as China stays within this pro-Russian neutrality. So I'm not optimistic in here.
Thank you. Those are great points also, because at the end of the day, it's also about economics that really matters for China, as you also pointed out earlier. Let's go to Lukas again. I have another military related question for you. So like us, Chinese analysts are, of course, also starting to question perhaps the resilience of Russian armor and weapons. Are there any indications that China has become more hesitant on purchasing Russian military equipment? And I do take note also of what you said earlier and some of the indications. These are early days, but I wonder if you could shed some light on these issues. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Leon. as you said, it's early days, and I think it's important not to overinterpret any of the existing evidence. But defense industrial cooperation between China and Russia is actually quite an interesting subject, and I think it is one that, to some extent, bears a little surprise. And let me perhaps situate this into in sort of historical framework, because I think it sort of more or less already presents an answer to defense industrial cooperation going forward. Defense ties, particularly during the early days of the Cold War, were a major confidence building measure. I mean, the PRC, suffered heavy losses, particularly after the Korean War in the 50s, and turned to the USSR for aid. And, Moscow agreed to provide rather significant defense industrial capacity building in the form of exchanges from scientists, but also, of course, the transfer of weapon systems. And that really structured China's defense industry in very similar ways to the USSR. So, there's some sort of institutional allegiance and relationship there. Of course, the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s then halted cooperation in areas of defense, and of course other areas as well. And only in the post-Cold War era, after the demise of the Soviet Union, we see that this cooperation picks up again. And there's obviously really two main factors for this. On the one hand, of course, a symbiotic relationship. Really, on the one hand, we see that the Soviet Union needed, or the Russia, after the demise of the Soviet Union, needed capital to keep its defense industrial base alive. And of course, China presented a welcome market for arms exports. And on the other hand, Tiananmen and the resulting arms embargo on China in the late 80s and early 90s, then of course also made China much more willing to procure Russian equipment. And we see really towards the sort of mid to late 1990s and early 2000s that arms sales have really picked up. And China back then had dozens of orders every year, very large orders, particularly for aircraft. For instance, the Russian Su-27, Su-30 fighters. And those really were orders in the billions of dollars. China saw Russia as a sort of provider of last resort, if you want. And the already sort of shared history of defense industrial cooperation, of course, helped that cooperation back then. But the peak really was in around sort of 2005, when I think China accounted for around 60% of Russian major weapons deliveries. And in the late 2000s, we see that Chinese procurement from Russia really slowed. We see a shift from systems of weapons to sort of components, and particularly in the period from sort of 2007 right up to 2020, 2021, we see a large decrease in the sort of quantity and also the value that China has procured from Russia. So where does this leave us, right? So we see that the relationship used to be very significant. So how significant is it at the present day? And how, as you mentioned, how may some of the setbacks that Russia has encountered in Ukraine affect procurement decisions on the Chinese side? And there, I think, sort of in line with military cooperation, we see a slight uptick over the last 5 years for certain kind of weapon systems, such as the Su-35 combat aircraft or the S-400, which is, of course, a missile system that Russia produces. But those really were the only larger purchases since the mid-2000s. And apart from that, I think, the sort of drive that China now has, particularly under Xi Jinping, towards defense industrial self-reliance and autarky, will in the future mean that this will more or less structure the relationship going forward. And I do not see that China will procure, a substantial amount of its military equipment from Russia going forward. Now, the very sort of, it's somewhat counterintuitive, and this is sort of the surprise that I was speaking of a little bit earlier, because both countries technically have a comparative advantage, right? I mean, in aerospace, for instance, Russia continues to hold an edge over China in some areas, the exception, of course, being unmanned aerial vehicles, right? Drones, where China is a market leader. But, on the other hand, China still continues to purchase turbofan engines, right? And particularly helicopters from Russia, which, demonstrates a sort of area where China might still be lagging behind. Russia has, fairly strong capabilities in submarines. China doesn't really. Russia, probably needs better surface ship capabilities. China has, built one of the largest, if not by some counts, the largest navy in the world. Right. So in theory, right, there would be plenty of comparative advantage to cooperate on going forward. But oddly enough, there is no sort of strategic overarching document, right, that structures this cooperation or that lays out a framework for defense industrial offsets. And in many ways, some of the few defense industrial offsets, the sort of industrial cooperation examples that we have, either stalled or they haven't really gotten off the ground in sort of a constructive and productive way. And in part, I think that might be suspicion on both sides, right? On the Russian side, the suspicion that Chinese manufacturers have actually copied quite a lot of Russian equipment in the past, sort of a hesitancy there to share IP, to share expertise, right? Also thinking that might be losing a market share here, right, in the global arms market, but also, of course, vis-a-vis Chinese companies. And on the Chinese side, it might be an overall hesitancy to become too dependent on Russian imports. And again, I've mentioned this already, but Xi Jinping has really tried to incentivize China's defense industrial base to become more self-reliant. So what are the prospects then? From my perspective, at the moment, it seems that China will further reduce major weapons purchases. I'm fairly certain that within the next decade, China will increasingly try to phase out the imports of Russian engines as well. And we do see, I think the last sort of large purchase that I remember were transport helicopters from Russia in 2019. So we do see these sort of occasional large purchases, but they're far away from the heydays in the early 2000s when China would place dozens of orders every year, or at least in every procurement cycle. Russia may also face supply issues, right? We already see in 2020 that I think Russia delayed a few deliveries of the S-400, the surface-to-air missile system. Some observers back then believed that the official explanation, which of course was cited as COVID, right, disruptions to supply chains, was actually a cover-up, right, for avoiding geopolitical issues, particularly with India, who of course is a large recipient of Russian arms and China's rival. That may also play into further cooperation between China and Russia in defense industrial, in the sort of defense industrial policy realm. And then, of course, we don't know how the sanctions will actually affect Russia's defense industrial base going forward. I would imagine that Russia is already having difficulties to meet some of its export timelines. And unless China can step in to aid Russia, which at the moment, at least, we don't have massive evidence for, right? China hasn't so far stepped in and saved Russia's defense industrial base. Unless that happens, I really don't see that relationship becoming stronger. And I think, broadly speaking, what we should be watching out for in this regard is high-level delegations, perhaps visiting each other, right? And, potentially in the future, Chinese components on the battlefield, sort of an uptick in trade, that would hint at changing patterns in this relationship. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Lukas. I know that Yu Jie has to go, unfortunately, soon. So I'll ask her a very brief question. What's the chitter-chatter on Chinese social media in terms of support or no support for this war? And maybe I'll ask another question that relates to one of the questions from our audience members, whether Beijing would ever play sort of a mediation type of role in this conflict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, I actually have to leave early. Very quickly, I think on Chinese social media, the opinions are quite divided. On the one hand, many consider this as a blatant invasion done by Moscow and therefore disapprove what Moscow has done. But then on the other hand, you also have some very hardcore nationalists and would believe that Beijing and Moscow form that very strong sense of bond of alliances with each other, or alignment, the word they prefer to use. So I think on social media, the views are not as being considered as being perceived as a one voice, as has been reported by mainstream media in this part of the world. Actually, the view are deeply divided on the issue. Now, step up support and also step up in terms of playing mediation role, as I said, because of Beijing's hindrance and Beijing's constraint on this pro-Russia neutrality, and therefore it would present them in a very weak position if they ever come into play the role of mediation. But secondly, I think we're also down to the capability issues. And we got to remember, this is a diplomatic team that has only begun to practice great power diplomacy, I think ever since from early 50s. And there are many things that the Chinese foreign ministry are still learning it by doing it. So to mediate certain conflict the scale like this, and that would require a lot of diplomatic finesse that China is still learning at this very moment. So I'm afraid, even if China is willing to, I think its capability will somehow hinder China's ability to do so. Now, just very quickly, though we're always trying to compare with the situation between Taiwan and Ukraine, I think the Chinese policymaker come into realization that if ever there might be a military escalation between Taiwan and Beijing, that perhaps China will not fare better when it comes to enduring the economic sanction, because many elements as Russia being sanctioned on the one hand are mostly prime materials, which are largely required by large part of the world. But however, for China's case, its main manufacturing products, main export is on low-end manufacturing that could be easily being replaced by other regional economic powerhouse as well. So I think Beijing will have to be very cautious. And as I said, what happened with Russia-Ukraine has offered Beijing a live simulation and try to be cautiously observe the situation, but not making any further move.
Thank you. Those are great observations, and thank you so much for joining us. I'll go to Alexander next. When it comes to authoritarian systems, it's crucial to keep a close eye on how the top leaders get along. There are reports of a shifting power balance between Putin and Xi after the most recent in-person encounter in Uzbekistan. What's your take on that, and what does this mean for the future of Sino-Russia relations? Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you very much again, Leon. And actually, I just wanted to very briefly also respond to the previous issue that was raised. I mean, first of all, just a tiny comment. When we talk about social media in China, because it's almost impossible to tell what the general trends are. But one important aspect is these are, of course, highly censored. And one general observation has been that the censors have certainly favored the pro-Russia camp. So we will probably not necessarily see kind of a truthful representation of what the majority of people necessarily thinks on social media, because a lot of the kind of comments critical of Russia have actually been more actively censored away. And actually about the mediation role for China, I just wanted to briefly say, I think this has been also one of the most interesting takeaways from my perspective of this, that China has so far really been missing in action on that front. You know, China has this claim to global preeminence, to global leadership, but we've seen absolutely no serious initiative so far in terms of mediation coming out of China. I think that's a very important lesson here as well. It's been interesting that what there has been in terms of semi-successful mediation missions have come from people like, for example, the Turkish President Erdogan and so on. And in the beginning, I think a lot of people were expecting China to take a more active role there. But yeah, because it has tied itself so much to Russia, but also because I think it generally wants to remain non-committal, almost to an extreme, we've really seen very little here. And that is also maybe have interesting implications for future conflicts or crises. Now, as for your specific question, the shifting power balance, yeah, I mean, of course, between Putin and Xi is also, of course, always a shifting power balance between Russia and China. And that's something which, to be fair, we've seen already for many years, all right? So there hasn't really been a real balance between the two for a very long time. China is outperforming Russia on almost all parameters of comparative power already for a long time. Just recently, we've reached the threshold, depending on exact measurements, of China's actually per capita GDP exceeding that of Russia's too. But it can fluctuate a bit, but basically at this threshold. Of course, nominal GDP is 10 times, roughly 10 times as large now. The military budget is 3 to 4 times as large, and so on. So of course, Russia still has some important assets, but I think couldn't really speak of a balance here for quite a long time. And one interesting aspect is, of course, Russia's strongest asset in this relationship has been its military strength. Its military expertise, its operational experience, and its force projection capabilities. And this presumably has really suffered now. Russia's, I think, reputation among many players in the world has really suffered on the military side of things. And there's been a certain demystification of Russia's abilities there. There's also been, of course, a very obvious material weakening through all the losses Russia has taken. So it's increasing dependence on outside supplies, also when it comes to advanced weapon systems. So there's that. There's the fact that Russia is increasingly isolated diplomatically. There's the economic dependence, which is growing, which already Cherry was talking about. So obviously, there has been a further shift in the power balance here. How does it play out in the interaction between the leaders? Well, of course, as I said, Xi is not likely to drop support for Putin anytime soon. But he certainly sees even less need, I think, now to kind of expose himself, to make this kind of more visible and conspicuous. And there have been these subtle signals, like, him not having personally called Putin on his birthday, these kind of small gestures. Putin seems to have become a bit more deferential in public, although that's hard to really assess. But yeah, certainly this already shifting power balance has been further kind of reinforced by those events. Also in places like Central Asia. I think that's also very interesting. We see Russia's grip in Central Asia certainly slipping to some extent. The regional countries have become less reverent, if you will. They've both been shocked by Russia's invasion, by the fact that Russia actually did this, and that they might do the same, of course, also in Central Asia, theoretically, but also encouraged by Russia's military debacle. So you have leaders like Tokayev of Kazakhstan, Rahmon in Tajikistan, who've been more openly critical of Russia recently. And that presumably means that China's role in that region will also be strengthening in relative terms. So I think we're going to be seeing a more dependent Russia, a Russia that will increasingly be compelled to submit itself to Beijing's strategic wishes, even when that means, for example, downgrading Russia's relations with Indo-Pacific countries like India and Vietnam that it has traditionally had close ties with. And as Alexander Gabuyev, who's a very astute observer of China-Russia relations, has said, we will probably be seeing Russia having to provide access to its most sophisticated weapon systems to China, more access to the Russian Arctic, more accommodation of Chinese security interests in Central Asia, more kind of favorable involvement in territorial dispute between China and its neighbors. So I think this is, very much the future of China-Russia relations. Now, of course, one silver lining maybe for Putin is the fact, since it is a very personalized relationship, the fact that Xi Jinping has been able to cement his leadership as a paramount leader in China for the foreseeable future, that probably, for Putin, is good news amid a lot of bad news, frankly. Thank you.
Thank you. And interesting observation also on the lack of a call on a birthday, but not just any birthday, but a 70th birthday. So that's a very, very important point also, that may symbolize things to come, perhaps. Although we have to be careful to not read too much into it, as what happens on the battlefield will very much also determine this relationship going forward. Lukas, I'm going to turn to you. We've run out of time pretty much, so maybe be as succinct as possible. But 2 weeks ago, the 20th National Congress took place, where the CCP reflected on its past strategies and presented China's next era. Could you shed some light on that, especially in terms of how this has impacted the CCP's future economic foreign policy strategies in relation to this war, And maybe if I can just sprinkle in a short question there from one of our audience members. Hugo Jones is asking whether the CCP will likely canonize the Russia-Ukraine war into its official history as a quote-unquote great changes unseen in a century, or a new type of international relations or new era. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. Obviously, great question. I wish we had an hour to talk about it, which unfortunately we don't. I'll try to be very brief. I think the Party Congress, really, of course, the most important political event in China, happening every 5 years. General Secretary Xi, as we've heard, has won a term, and I think overall, judging from the Congress report, really China has put forth a very somber assessment of the international affairs. Trying to combine the reality of the international environment with seeking at the same time development opportunities. And I think China still sees strategic opportunity in engaging, particularly on, of course, global governance of the global economy and things like technology and global supply chains. But I think both of these are heavily qualified, and they're more so qualified than in the past and in past reports. So in that sense, China is seeing itself as much more challenged to take advantage of its relationship with the sort of global, quote unquote, liberal order than in the past. And I think, the war hasn't been mentioned explicitly in these documents, right, which is obviously in and of itself telling as to what kind of framing China wants to put forth of the war and of the conflict. But I think it's worth thinking about, going forward, how a much more strategic, much more cautiously engaging China will be seeing the China-Russia relationship. And I can't really do any better than Alexander has already done. I think that was a fantastic summary. Perhaps the only thing that I might add is that China will very likely turn more inwards, and it will very likely seek more self-reliance, right, in technology, in key sectors. I already mentioned the defense industry, and very likely, I think, if we will see that, if its relationship with Russia isn't beneficial to achieve these goals, those that were laid out in the 14th Five-Year Plan, those that Xi Jinping has laid out in slogans such as common prosperity, or dual circulation, then I think, if the party gets the choice, the party will choose itself first. And in that sense, I think what I expect to see is a further instrumentalization of the China-Russia relationship to the benefit of Beijing. But, trying to carefully to keep that straddle alive, the straddle with the smaller states in South Asia, in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and of course, straddle with an increasingly hostile West, right, from Beijing's perspective, all while trying to tie this into a foreign policy that it nonetheless allows Beijing to engage Moscow in some of the ways that we've already mentioned that it wants to continue engaging with Russia. I think overall, though, I don't see the Party Congress as, a heralding war or heralding a more aggressive foreign policy. I think and some observers may disagree with me here, particularly on questions of Taiwan, but looking at Ukraine, I think China is still concerned with the fact that disruption to the international order will in turn disrupt and harm China's own economic safety. And I think there still is a strong belief among senior leaders. So in that sense, right, China will still privilege stability and long-termism over the opposite, over chaos. In terms of the question that was raised, I think this really depends, how the Ukraine war will be framed going forward will really depend on who wins, right? And what winning will mean. Is Russia able to turn, some benefit on the battlefield around? Very unlikely that will be the case, but I'll leave that sort of in the room. Is Ukraine going to win, and what will that victory look like? Because I think if, a lot is tied to the relationship between Putin and Xi, and we've already heard that that relationship obviously is evolving increasingly towards China as a more senior and more powerful actor. So I think in that sense, building upon the analysis that I've just given, Ukraine being largely absent from official signaling around the Party Congress, I don't expect it to suddenly become included as a major turning point in any official party documents. But You never know, but I will sort of caveat my analysis here by saying that I think it depends on the outcome of the war overall. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Lukas. And for the reminder also about that China still remains concerned about disruption to the international order. If we had more time, it would have been interesting also to discuss how Russia pulling out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, for example, will also impact on how China reacts to that, given that some 38 countries, many of them developing countries, are purchasing grain through that initiative. So, but maybe that's something to discuss later on, the issue of food security and how China has managed that. I'd like to just thank again all three of our panelists for their participation. I think all of you have made some great points. Alexander, Yu Jie, and Lukas, of course. And I'd like to ask our audience to please join us again in 2 weeks for our Russia-Ukraine dialogues to focus on non-aligned perspectives in the midst of the G20 Bali summit. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.